In this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's been going on in Iraq since 1991. So, looking at this map briefly, which is a map of the ethno-religious makeup of Iraq. And as you can see, Iraq seems to be split by region, where you have a southern part of Iraq that it has a large majority of Shia, but Shia Arab rather than Shia Persians that you find in Iran, and a northern part of the country that is split between a Sunni Arab minority and a Sunni Kurd minority. You also have some small number of Turks and Christians as well in the north of the country. So, this map might be slightly out of date now. I think populations have moved about quite a bit since this map was published, particularly because of the civil war going on in the north of Iraq, primarily north of Baghdad, especially involving ISIS groups. But it's at least an approximation of what things looked like, probably even as recently as 2010 or so. Now, quick historical background here. It's worth noting that Sunnis have traditionally achieved most positions of political authority in Iraq right up until the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003. So this is true under the Ottoman Empire. This was certainly true under previous non-Turkic empires. And this was also true under Saddam Hussein, who hailed from Tikrit, just north of Iraq, and who was Sunni, although in fairness, Saddam Hussein wasn't particularly sectarian himself. He was from the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party is a party that exists in many different Arab countries. It's an Arab socialist party. It is a secularist party under which religion plays no real official role, but because religion and tribal affiliation often go hand in hand, much of the Ba'ath Party infrastructure in Iraq under Saddam Hussein was populated by Sunnis who belonged to affiliated tribes with Saddam Hussein. Although it's worth noting, Saddam Hussein intelligently also appointed members of other religious and ethnic groups to his government. The most famous being his foreign minister Tariq Aziz, who was Christian and played a pretty important role, especially during the Gulf War, in speaking for the regime. Okay, to add to this sort of traditional Sunni-Shia divide, and Iraq is one of the most divided countries between Sunni and Shia. There's a slight, as you saw on the map, there is a slight 60-40 Shia numerical majority, but of course, politically, in terms of political importance and political clout, as well as income, I think the split is much more even, and if anything, it's a little bit tilted towards the Sunni. Now, to add to the Sunni-Shia split, we have also the Kurds. And who are the Kurds? Well, the Kurds are Sunni Muslims, but they are not Arabs. They speak Kurd, which is a language in its own right that's just as old as Arabic. And there are many Iraqi Kurds in the north, particularly around the city of Mosul. So there are 4 million Iraqi Kurds, but it's worth noting that there are also 13 million Kurds in Turkey and 5 to 6 million Kurds in Iran, and about 1 million in Syria, although that number has to be taken with a grain of salt given the events in Syria over the past 4 or 5 years. So there are some Kurds spread all across the Middle East. famous Kurd that you might have heard of, Saladin, the famous military hero and governor of Egypt, who liberated Jerusalem from the Christian Crusaders on behalf of a couple of different Muslim empires. Saladin was in fact Iraqi and Kurdish originally. Now, Kurds have never really enjoyed much political autonomy in the Middle East. They have always been under the thumb of many empires. This is true for the Kurds, and of course it's been true for other Middle Eastern nations, other Middle Eastern ethnic groups. Some Kurds identify with their nation state. They simply, in part because they share a religion frequently with those whom they share a state with, but lots of Kurds also dream of creating a Kurdistan, a Kurdish state that would defend their own Kurdish interests. But of course, that project is made very, very difficult by how spread out Kurds are, and of course, none of the countries in the region particularly want to cede any of their territory to create this Kurdish state. Kurds have therefore been repressed quite vigorously by Iraq under Saddam Hussein, who used chemical weapons against Kurds when they revolted in the 1980s. The Turkish government has conducted a systematic campaign of trying to pacify the Kurds in eastern Anatolia, where they live. In particular, they've aggressively tried to prevent the spread of the Kurdish language by banning its use in schools and by forcing Turkish Kurds to learn Turkish and discouraging the use of Kurdish wherever possible. Kurds are frequently discriminated against in employment and other opportunities. The Kurds have formed a party in the Turkish political system, so they are represented democratically, but socially and economically, you could say they are discriminated against and are much poorer than the Turkish majority, and that's also true of the Kurds in Iran and the Kurds in Syria. Arguably, until fairly recently, the Kurds in Syria were probably the best treated of them all, but I guess today it's probably better to be Kurd in Iran than anywhere else, which is probably saying something. So you have a people here that don't have a state, and some of them dream of forming a state. There are several Kurdish militias. I think the most important one is the PKK, which has also a communist affiliation. There's also the PUK, which is more democratic. These are groups that have armed themselves and at various times have fought against the Iraqi state, the Turkish state, and sometimes conducted guerrilla operations in other areas as well. Okay, so the Kurds are definitely a player in Iraqi politics and one worth keeping an eye on. What makes all of this even more complicated in the case of Iraq is not only do we have religious divisions between Sunni and Shia, not only do we have linguistic divisions between Kurdish speakers, Arab speakers, and a very small minority of Farsi, that is to say, I guess you would call it Iranian, but the language is Farsi speakers in Iraq. Not only do you have those divisions, but you, of course, also have so you have linguistic divisions, you have religious divisions, and you have ethnic divisions, and all of that is rather difficult. And of course, you have people who have a national allegiance to the Iraqi state, and many who feel no such allegiance to the Iraqi state, believing that the Iraqi state is largely a colonial creation by the British. There was an Iraqi mandate, after all, by the British that formed the basis of the modern Iraqi state. There's nothing particularly natural or historical about the current boundaries of Iraq or many other places in the Middle East, and so there are those who have identified with an Iraqi national identity, and they are often represented by the Al-Iraqi Party. which doesn't tend to do very well in elections, at least not recently, but certainly exists. And of course, then you have a variety of sectarian parties, which either group around a religious affiliation, or group around an ethnic affiliation, or a linguistic affiliation. So you have, or religious affiliation. Yeah, I think I already said religious affiliation. So you have a lot of ethno-linguistic and religious complexity in Iraq, and at different times in Iraqi history, these things have been more or less important. Under Saddam Hussein, the religious dimension wasn't terribly important, at least right up until the end of his rule, when it started to become a little bit more important. What was primarily important was under Saddam Hussein's regime was allegiance to the state of Iraq, and to a lesser extent tribal affiliation with the historical tribes, which sometimes can be religiously separated. You can have a tribe that has members that are Sunni and Shia. You don't generally have tribes that are Kurdish and Arab speaking, but you do have tribes that are split religiously, and of course all of this creates some additional complexity. Okay. So, you know what happened during the Iraq War of '91. You know, we've discussed a little bit about why the United States chose to invade Iraq in 2003. So I guess the next logical step is what happens between 2003 and 2011 when American troops finally withdraw from Iraq. Well, between these two dates, the United States helped establish a parliamentary democracy in Iraq. Okay, what's a parliamentary democracy? Well, a parliamentary democracy is a democracy similar to what you see in Europe. That is to say, in Western Europe for the most part, with the exception of Great Britain, which has a first-past-the-post majoritarian democracy like the United States. I'm sorry, first-past-the-post electoral system like the United States. The United States doesn't have a majoritarian electoral system. Okay, what does this mean to have a parliamentary democracy in practice? Well, in part, it has to do with your electoral system, how votes by individual voters get translated into seats in parliament for political parties. In the United States, we vote by district, largely, which means that whoever wins the most votes in a given district gets to represent that district. In parliamentary system, typically it's not the district that gets represented, but it's parties. You vote for a political party, and however many however many votes that party gets dictates how many seats that party ends up getting in the parliament, right? So it's parliamentary in the sense that however many votes a certain party gets, if you get 30% of the vote, then you're going to get 30% of the seats. End of story. So in that sense, Iraq has a proportional representation system. That proportional representation system in Iraq is limited by the fact that you have to get 10% of the seats in order to get seated at all, which creates a bias against very small parties. However, there are exceptions to that because there are certain seats that are reserved in the Iraqi constitution for Christian, Yazidi, and other Turkmen minorities within the country. Not many seats, but at least there's some representation that's reserved for minorities, which they have to get. What else? Also worth noting, it's an open list proportional system, which means that candidates are also listed. So it's not just a case that you vote for a party, but you'll have like a list of candidates for a given party, and you don't just vote for a party, but you vote for a candidate within that party, at least at the national level, right? So in national elections for the national parliament, you vote for a candidate, and candidates for a party are seated in the order in which they get votes. So it's an open list where you vote for actual individual candidates, not for the party. And if enough people vote for your candidate, then of course, and your party, then of course that candidate's going to get seated. Okay, there's been 3 elections since the United States invaded in 2003. The elections were held in late 2005. People were seated in 2006, and then 2010, 2014, following a 4-year cycle. So far, the State of Law Coalition a coalition of mainly Shia parties has won all of these elections. The party is officially led by Nouri al-Maliki, who became prime minister in 2006 and 2010, but in 2014, or after the elections of 2014, where uh, the state of law coalition also won, Nouri al-Maliki was ousted as prime minister. There was a lot of infighting within the coalition, and a lot of unhappiness at his leadership, and so Haidar al-Abadi now leads the coalition as prime minister, but Nouri al-Maliki is still an important player, and he's the head of the Al-Dawa party, which is the largest party in the state of law coalition. So the state of law coalition is in fact a coalition of multiple parties that have decided to band together in order to form a government, in order to create a majority in the parliament, and there are many parties in the Iraqi parliament. This is probably something that will abate over time. That is to say, typically what happens in new democracies is that you see many parties running and getting seats in the first few elections, and then over time, as the political system consolidates, if the Iraqi political system does consolidate, what you're likely to see is fewer and fewer parties winning, with the small parties getting eaten up by the larger parties, and you may end up seeing you know, two and a half, three, four, maybe five parties. Although in fairness, Iraq, this is still open because, of course, people vote often along sectarian lines. Like we said, there's a lot of ethno-religious complexity, which means that people often won't vote for parties that represent or that they feel represent the interests of another constituency, and so you might see a large number of parties still endure. All of this, of course, makes the politicking and the coalition building all the more difficult once the votes are in, because no party typically wins a 50% majority, and so every party has to rule in coalition with other parties, and those coalitions can be fairly uneasy. So, what we can say so far, anyway, is that Shia Muslims who, again, have not had political power for most of Iraq's history, seem to be voting more or less along sectarian lines. That is to say, Shia Muslims seem to be voting mostly for Shia parties, whereas Sunni Muslims tend to be split. Some of them vote for Kurdish parties because they're Kurds. Some of them vote for nationalist parties because they think that the Iraqi nation is what's most important. And finally, some of them vote for Sunni parties, often Islamic-oriented Sunni parties, and so what you see is the Sunni vote is largely split, and the Shia vote is largely in block. And so, for the moment anyway, the Sunni feel that unlike it was the case throughout most of their history, the Shia seem to be dominating and seem to be ruling along sectarian lines. That is to say, they seem to be filling posts in the bureaucracy and in the army with Shia personnel, and this makes a lot of people uneasy, and that's also one of the reasons why there have been a few insurgencies, mainly from disaffected Sunni Muslims who feel like they used to have power and who feel like the Shia are taking over their country and kind of cozying up to Iran, which they think is obviously a scary proposition for them. And so you have some sectarian violence, mainly religious violence, religiously motivated violence, with perhaps a smattering as well of Kurdish resistance, although the Kurds have not been quite so quick to take up arms against the Iraqi state. Of course, the Kurds have taken up arms against ISIS, which invaded the country and has spread throughout the country through large sections of northern Iraq right up until the present. Okay, so why did the United States leave Iraq in 2011? We said that since 2011, Iraq has largely been self-governing. And again, just like when we're asking why the United States invaded Iraq, we've got a mix of domestic and systemic reasons. Domestic reasons include the fact the U.S. public has largely tired of the cost of the war in Iraq, particularly since the benefits that were promised have not materialized, largely speaking. The United States has not really profited very much from the oil fields of Iraq. The United States doesn't seem to be reaping geopolitical benefits in the region. The region seems less stable now than it was in 2003, with ISIS and Iran being possibly destabilizing factors. In fact, if anything, Iran seems to be stronger, in a stronger position than it was in 2003. Uh, there are also systemic reasons. The United States was at the time facing insurgencies in Afghanistan that were threatening to overrun uh, the government that they had set up there, and that means that resources and troops that were in Iraq seem to be needed much more urgently in Afghanistan, and so that's one reason to pull out as well. And of course, there's other reasons. The Shia-dominated government in Iraq has fairly close ties to Iran and doesn't particularly want an indefinite American presence in Iraq, and that sentiment is probably shared also by many others in the country, not just the Shia, that may be fairly thankful to the Americans for having gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, but do not want the United States to be dictating politics in Iraq, certainly do not want American troops stationed in Iraq indefinitely, and so uh, have politely or less politely requested that the Americans kindly leave. Okay, so that's all for that. As always, if you have questions, you know how to reach me.